Often, we have the desire to take a more difficult or wrong road, although we know that it will not be a good choice. This is the case of 35-year-old Nobukazu Kuriki, a famous Japanese climber who posted his adventures on social media. These are the images and videos that Kuriki posted to his ever-updated Facebook page, in which he explained his projects. The departure to Nepal, the last in his life, and the trekking to the Everest Base Camp. On May 21st, 2018, Kuriki suddenly stopped posting content on Facebook, and shortly after, his team reports that there were problems. For climbers and fans, the death of Japanese alpinist and motivational speaker Nobukazu Kuriki was utterly devastating. Those who knew him or simply knew his story marveled at his determination. This was a man who, despite losing 9 fingers to frostbite on a previous attempt, remained undeterred in his quest to reach Everest summit. When he tried again in May 2018, he came tantalizingly close to achieving his goal. With only 1,500 meters left to go before he reached the Everest summit, Kuriki was suddenly struck by fever and a debilitating cough. However, his courage compelled him to not only forge ahead, but to update his social media accounts to tell the world that nothing would stop him. What did Kuriki really intend on Everest? This question has been bothering people ever since the 35-year-old Japanese climber was found dead on 21st of May at an altitude of about 6,600 meters. Kuriki had made a secret of his exact plan in the weeks before. He wanted to climb through the Southwest Fall, his team said after Kuriki's death. Since the first ascent by the British Douglas Scott and Dougal Haston in fall of 1975, only about 30 climbers have successfully climbed the southwest face, and only one without bottled oxygen. Josef Just was the only climber of a 4-man Slovak team to reach the summit in fall 1988. During the descent, he and his 3 other teammates died. There had never been a serious solo attempt on the steep and dangerous southwest face before Kuriki's entry into the wall. Did such a climb make sense to Kuriki? Against this background alone, Kuriki's chances of success had to be rated as extremely low, even if he had been in top form. However, the Japanese mountaineer was not. After arriving at base camp, he suffered from severe cough and fever. 2 days before he died, Kuriki said he still had a slight cough, adding that it was almost gone. Kuriki entered the wall and pitched up his tent at 7,300 meters. There, he assured by radio that he would be careful. He must have gotten worse at night. The next morning, his team informed that Kuriki was therefore descending. After that, there were no signs of life from him. Members of the camera crew, who were there to film his ascent from the slopes of Nuptse, searched for him and finally found him. He had slipped from a few hundred meters just below Camp 3. Did Kuriki really believe that he could master the southwest face? The Japanese climber Ken Noguchi said that he doesn't think so. It seems to me that at some point his goal was no longer about stepping foot on the summit, but exposing himself to the toughest conditions imaginable and sharing that with people on social media. Also, on his 7 attempts of Mount Everest, 6 of them ended in fall. Kuriki often seemed to overestimate his abilities. In 2012, he suffered severe frostbite during an attempt via the West Ridge. 9 of his 10 fingers had to be amputated. Nevertheless, he returned to Everest. Noguchi went on, he would have had a good chance of ascent without oxygen if he had only taken the southeast ridge. But that would have meant not doing it solo. Obviously, Kuriki was also under pressure. A Japanese friend said that the local media had lost interest in the climber over time because he had always made big plans that realistically did not promise success. Maybe Kuriki finally over-tightened the screw which often ends deadly on the highest mountains on Earth. However, Kuriki's death was not seen as stupidity for many of his fans, rather as something to believe in until the end. I have respect for you because you continued to push yourself forward until the very end. Thank you so much for your inspiration and courage. To see many posts dedicated to Nobukazu Kuriki.
This may be the last interview of Scott Fisher before he disappeared on that mountain behind Everest, near the summit. It's unknown why one of the strongest and most experienced mountaineers in the world disappeared that day. There is a select group of people in the world who have gazed at the earth from its two highest points, Everest and K2. Scott Fisher, a 40-year-old native of Michigan who settled in Seattle, is one of them. Fisher had made a living out of mountaineering and contributed his adventurousness to a variety of charitable causes. On Friday, May 10, 1996, a severe and sudden storm had trapped several climbers high on Everest as they were descending from the summit. In what has become the deadliest single tragedy in the mountain's climbing history, a total of 8 people perished. One of them is the renowned Seattle climbing guide Scott Fisher. Only in 2010, his body was found. It was near the balcony of Mount Everest. Fisher was also the first American to climb Lhotse, the world's 4th highest peak in Nepal, and among the third party of Americans to summit K2. With his trekking business, Mountain Madness, Fisher became one of the first mountaineers to offer guided treks to many peaks, including those of the world's biggest mountains. In truly American style, Fisher may also be the first serious mountain climber who was turned on to the sport by television. Inspired by a program he saw on his local public television station in New Jersey when he was 14, he spent the next 2 years taking climbing courses and moved west when he graduated high school. He and his wife, Jeannie Price, moved to Seattle in 1982, where they had 2 children. To his friends and compatriots, Fisher was more than the sum of his adventures. He was a strong, determined climber who inspired others. He was definitely charismatic, and he really motivated people. As a guide, he took great pleasure in getting his clients to the top. Scott E. Fisher founded the Mountain Madness Company in 1984 to allow his customers to reach the peaks of the highest mountains in the world. It cost $50,000 each to go up there with him. Fisher was concerned not only with making the summit, but also with keeping the world's great mountainsides clean. In 1994, he headed up the Everest Environmental Project, one of the first credible efforts to collect the debris that had been gathering for 40 years. His team cleared out 250 oxygen bottles and 5,000 pounds of garbage from the mountain. This was Fisher's 5th trek to Everest. Just before he left, he told a reporter for the Seattle Weekly that he was certain he would return. "It doesn't count if you don't make it back down," he said. To many mountaineers in Seattle and around the world who feel his loss, his 5th climb up Everest counted very much. Scott Fisher was experienced in keeping all the variables at bay while leading expeditions to the top of the world. Guiding a team of Mountain Madness clients, assisted by Neil Beetleman and Anatoly Bukriv, 2 of the most elite climbers in the world, Fisher timed this ascent with consideration for the weather records on Everest. The week of May 5 through 12 has historically offered the best conditions for climbing. After weeks at base camp and days of slow climbing, with time to acclimate to the extreme altitude, the top of Everest at 29,000 1,028 feet, is in the jet stream, where there is a third of the oxygen available at sea level. It took advantage of clear weather on Thursday, May 9, to make a summit bid. Fisher died on 10 May 1996 during one of the darkest days of mountaineering on Everest. On that day, Fisher, Anatoly Bukriv, and Neil Badelman drove 8 of their clients to reach the summit of Everest. During the descent, the team was hit by a strong snowstorm. All the mountaineers managed to reach Camp 4 at Col Sud, 7,900 meters, with the exception of Fisher. Fisher, who had reached the summit at about 3:45 p.m., had considerable difficulties in the descent. With him was the Sherpa chief Lopsong Jungbu, but just below the south peak he was unable to continue and convinced Lopsong to descend without him. Lopsong went down alone, hoping to be able to send someone else with extra oxygen to help Fisher down. Bukriv, after coming down with his clients in the morning, made several attempts to reach Fisher. However, he was forced to turn back after the second attempt due to the weather. Even though he did not find Fisher, still managed to save many people who were difficult to recover. Finally, around 7 a.m. on 11 May, Bukriv managed to reach Fisher's position, but unfortunately it was already too late. It was impossible for Bukriv to bring his companion's body back downstream. He secured the backpack over his face and left it on the ledge where he lay. Then he took his camera, his ice axe, and his favorite penknife. The latter will be delivered upon the return of the expedition by mountaineer Beetleman to Fisher's 9-year-old son, who was waiting for his father's return to Seattle. Only in May 2010 was Fisher's body found on the mountain at over 8,000 meters. But the Fisher family wanted the body to stay where it was found. One of the greatest mysteries is how a man so experienced died on Everest. Some climbers, in fact, claim that Scott became too tired by repeatedly going up and down in the camps and handling clients. Maybe that was true, or perhaps he finally succumbed to acute altitude sickness after Camp 4. Numerous climbers stated that Scott was very tired and could not speak to them, and the return climb combined with the storm inevitably weakened him. A devastating storm engulfed the upper slopes of the mountain. He rappelled down a few large slabs and continued to the southeast ridge to a flat platform a few square meters in size, at 8,430 meters, known as the balcony. His only hope of survival was to reach the relative safety of a tent at Camp 4, pitched 450 meters below at the South Col. In a frigid whiteout, battling extreme gales, he collapsed on the snow about 50 meters below the balcony. Sometime later, disoriented by cerebral edema and hypothermia, he ripped off his oxygen mask and gloves and opened his down jacket. Engulfed in the torrid storm, exposed and alone on the mountain at night, Fisher deteriorated over the following 15 or so hours and finally succumbed, just below the balcony on Everest's triangular face at about 8,400 meters. If the strongest man in the world in these conditions could perish, it may be that fate decreed this time it was Scott's turn. There is a long history of amateurs who are passionate about climbing. For example, the late Disney president Frank Wells, and then doctors, lawyers, and financiers. In the mid-90s, the 40-year-old Sandy Pittman, bored with life as the socialite wife of MTV creator Bob Pittman, transformed enthusiasm for mountaineering and adventuring into an obsession. Her fixation had cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars, and perhaps her marriage. Human beings were not designed to survive at 8,000 meters. Those who stay up too high, too long, will eventually be overcome by the altitude. This is the reason climbers refer to all peaks above 26,000 feet as the death zone. When Sandy Hill Pittman reached Mount Everest's summit at roughly 2:30 p.m. on May 10, 1996, she wasted no time celebrating. Pittman's reputation from her previous 2 Everest attempts was already well established. People are still talking about the first time she arrived in 1993. She returned to Everest the following year on an expedition sponsored for $200,000 and videotaped for NBC. This time, Pittman attempted to climb the Kangshung Face, technically the most difficult ascent. She spent thousands of dollars to hire 4 of the best climbers in the world, but in the end they were turned back because of bad weather. Pittman was so frustrated, she tore a gold cross with semi-precious stones off her neck and hurled it, much to the horror of the Sherpas, who watched what to them was a small fortune disappear. Everest was the last peak in Pittman's grand plan to become the 3rd woman in history to scale the 7 summits, the highest mountains on each continent. The experience would provide a finale to her book in progress and bring her one step closer to realizing her dream of becoming a sportswoman with media tie-ins. Pittman's team was organized by Scott Fisher, a 40-year-old professional guide based in Seattle, who co-founded the trekking company Mountain Madness. With 3 guides and 7 Sherpas, Fisher would lead 8 clients up the southeast route. Before attempting the summit, Fisher's team spent a month at base camp. Pittman was described by Mountain Madness as a competent climber. She was, in fact, a good deal more experienced than some of those in other expeditions. From the beginning, she was a large presence on the mountain. Most of the climbers at base camp had read enough to know she was the glamorous wife of a multimillionaire. But she tended to advertise her wealth, and she made no secret of the fact that she was friends with the powerful. On May 10, the anniversary of the previous record when 37 climbers reached the summit was chosen as the day for the ascent. The night before the climb, about 24 mountaineers in 3 groups, Fisher's team, a New Zealand group, and a Taiwanese group, gathered. It was a clear night. The moon was huge. The next afternoon, when Sandy Pittman hauled herself to the world's highest vantage, she jubilantly exchanged high fives with the climbers already crowding the peak. But reaching the summit is only half the journey, and most accidents happen on the way down. Pittman was already very tired. Observers from another team said she had to be short roped by a Sherpa on the way up, and she was the last client in her group to reach the summit, with Fisher following as rear guide. She didn't have time to do more than snap a few pictures. It was lucky that she got down fast. For the next 4 people, not including the Sherpas, no more than 15 minutes behind her, ran into trouble. Makalu Gao, a Taiwanese climber, was discovered half frozen the following day and was delivered from death's door in one of the highest helicopter rescues ever. Fisher and Rob Hall, the New Zealand expedition leader, who stopped to help his client Doug Hansen, were not so lucky. Pittman continued to fatigue badly on the way down. Charlotte Fox, an experienced climber, had just given her a shot, a dexamethasone, unzipping the back corner of Pittman's suit and jabbing the needle into her buttocks, right through her other clothes. An anti-inflammatory with amphetamine-like side effects, the drug is usually administered only as a last resort. But Pittman was completely exhausted. By the time the storm hit full force, a large group of climbers had descended the fixed ropes. Badelman, Pittman, Fox, Madsen, Gamelgard, and Claire Schoening were all part of Fisher's team. There was no way to tell which direction led, back up or down. Half blind and battered by the wind, the group scattered in different directions on the saddle between Locke and Everest. It was like swimming in a glass of milk, a very turbulent glass of milk, for another 8 to 10 hours. All were now out of oxygen, with the wind chill lowering temperatures to 100 degrees below freezing. The climbers were shaking uncontrollably from hypothermia. Sometime around midnight, the storm subsided. The stars came out, and the climbers decided to make a mad dash for safety. But Madsen was barely conscious, and Pittman and Fox were too weak to walk. When it was 1:30 a.m., Beetleman told Anatoly Bukri, a burly Russian guide, that the others were in grave danger. Bukri, 38, a world-class climber who grew up in the Ural Mountains, set out immediately. But the storm had picked up again. There was zero visibility. Meanwhile, Fox and Sandy Pittman had completely given up. By 3 a.m., they had been out for 30 hours. Tim Madsen had a better attitude. He said, "Move your legs." But after searching for 30 minutes, Bucriev saw a light. He heard Matson yelling. Quickly he gave Pittman oxygen, left Matson with her, and took Fox to camp, covering the quarter mile in 40 minutes. Exhausted, he tried to find other climbers to help. Nobody would or could, so Bucriev headed back out into the storm alone. When he reached Matson, he gave him oxygen and told him he had to stand up and walk. Pittman tried to do the same. Pittman couldn't say much. "I'm tired. I cannot." So Anatoly Bucriev half carried, half dragged Sandy Pittman back to Camp 4. That morning, Bucriev started to search for Fisher, a close friend. He found him frozen in the snow, his oxygen mask still on. No one will ever know exactly what happened, whether he was overcome by the altitude or simply wrung out from weeks of shepherding clients up and down the mountain. The survivors had spent an exhausted few hours in the tents on Camp 4 in the South Col at 26,000 feet. All were relatively unscathed. All were overwrought and extremely lethargic from the high altitude. They had to get down lower as soon as possible. They finally reached base camp on Monday, May 13. There, they heard the tragic tale of Rob Hall's farewell satellite call to his pregnant wife in New Zealand before he signed off and waited to die in a crevasse near the summit. 3 Indian climbers on the north side of the mountain had also perished. The death toll stood at 8. The following day, there was a memorial service for Fisher, and the group talked about their grief and guilt. People were torn up about the death. Earlier, they had made a pact that no one would talk to the press until they were all down from the mountain. But the next morning, when the team hiked down to Frisch, the town below base camp, it was obvious that Pittman was in a hurry to split. First thing Friday, she chartered a helicopter to Kathmandu for thousands of dollars, offering a ride to Matson and the team doctor. For the same sum, she could have chartered a large Russian helicopter to take everyone down. In Kathmandu, Pittman headed straight for the hotel, where she fielded calls from the world press. As she sunbathed by the pool, Pittman was easily identifiable by reporters by her bandaged fingertips and the Hermes catalog on the table beside her. On Monday, May 20, Fisher's team gathered in the hotel garden for a group picture. Pittman, who had originally refused to pose for the media, arrived fully made up. The other climbers, most of them casually dressed, appeared taken aback. After the photo shoot, Pittman hosted a blowout cocktail party in honor of Fisher. Throughout the evening, there was an almost palpable tension between Pittman and some of her fellow climbers. There were those who felt she tried to keep her distance from Biederman and Bucriev, the men who had risked their own necks to save hers. Journalist John Krakauer had no doubt that Scott Fisher died because he was exhausted from guiding amateur climbers. Rob Hall clearly died in the act of rescuing his amateur client. But Pittman maintained that there were no heroes that night, that the guys were just doing their jobs, what they were paid to do. On May 22nd, Sandy Pittman left for New York. One fellow climber suggests that even at the time of her departure, Pittman was still reeling from the shock, that she had been truly humbled by the ferocity of the mountain. Some fellow climbers said wryly, "Princess Sandy, very rich, very spoiled." It is also true that Pittman inspires much jealousy around New York. She's good-looking, climbs mountains, and pilots her own helicopter. Who can pitch in and talk to her about climbing K2 at a dinner party? No one can say that Sandy Pittman hasn't worked hard or seriously committed herself to building her prowess as a climber and sportswoman. But whoever the person in question is, rich or poor, strong or clumsy, it is always Everest that decides how it will turn out.
This may be the last photo about Andy Harris, took by John Krakauer, just below the summit of Everest around 2 p.m. on May 10, 1996, waiting to rappel down the Hillary step while a scrum of climbers ascends the fixed rope. The summit of Lhotse is engulfed by boiling storm clouds in the distance. After the crowd slowly passed Day, Andy and John eventually rappelled down the fixed rope, but a few hours later Andy got a desperate radio call from Rob Hall asking him to climb back up to the summit to help rescue a severely debilitated client, Doug Hansen. It was a heroic act on Andy's part that ended in tragedy. Andy and Rob were unable to get down lower than the south summit, and all three men died in the storm. Harris was one of the more altruistic guides on the expedition. He came to the assistance of anyone and everyone without hesitation. But this sense of loyalty on Everest, which turns out to be his downfall. Harris's death is one of the single biggest tragedies to unfold during the 1996 expedition. Harris and his girlfriend had just begun building a house, but he couldn't resist the lure of the mountain. Harris was one of the New Zealanders' guides for adventure consultants, along with Rob Hall and Mike Grom. Before even reaching base camp, Harris suffered from multiple gastrointestinal attacks during their journey. Harris proceeded to base camp with the rest of the party on April 1996. On the day made during a climb, Harris was struck in the chest by a boulder the size of a small television. Although shocked, he continued to climb. If the boulder had hit his head, he would not have survived. Shortly after midnight on 10th May, the Adventure Consultants expedition began the summit attempt from 8,000 meters on Camp 4, on the top of the South Col. At approximately 1 p.m., Harris, Anatoly Bukriv, and Krakauer reached the top of Everest. Later on, Harris checked on some oxygen canisters near the southeast ridge and stated they were all empty, which they were not. It's believed Harris was suffering from hypoxia, which would explain some of the irrational action he took. It has, however, never been proven. Meanwhile, upon returning to Camp 4, Krakauer, possibly suffering from the effects of hypoxia, believed he had encountered Harris on the ridge above camp. Instead, it's likely that the climber he encountered was a client from the Mountain Madness expedition, Martin Adamans. In the morning on May 11, after a search of camp, the climbers at Camp 4 realized that Harris was missing. Krakauer, who survived the disaster, wrote a book on the tragedy. He wrote that Harry's actions, or failure to act, played a direct role in his death. Harris's ice axe and jacket were found near Rob Hall's body several days later. It's unknown what happened to him, as his body was never found. Before he died, Hall mentioned that Harris had been with him. It's likely that Harris went to aid Rob Hall and Doug Hansen when they were trapped higher up on the mountain as the storm came in. A few minutes from Gorashep towards the Everest Base Camp, a memorial was built for the members of the Adventure Consultants team that died during the expedition: Andy Harris, Rob Hall, Doug Hansen, and Yasuko Namba. For his bravery, Harris received the New Zealand Bravery Star in the 1999. Did they ever find Harris' body on Everest? Rob Hall and Scott Fisher remain where they died. Where Doug Hansen and Andy Harris are is a mystery. No trace of the man has ever been found, and Everest is keeping their icy tombs to herself. Someone thinks that they have fallen along the interminable rock face that falls sheer to the Valley of Silence, remaining in some hidden cave. Others say that after more than 25 years, natural elements are likely to have swallowed them, but not their equipments. But now it doesn't matter anymore. They will remain the never-ending story of this great mountain. In the 2015 film Everest, Harris was portrayed by actor Martin Anderson.